Improving Student Success in the Classroom. This is from the October 4th UWM Student Success Summit. I'm Connie Schrader from CETL, the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and this portion is called High Level Performance Expectations. The outcomes are that by the end of this brief session, you'll be able to help the faculty in your department create clear, high-level performance expectations in your courses, assignments, and activities to challenge and engage students. So if you look at your syllabus or think about a specific course, what are the levels of learning in your course outcomes or your assignments? What does that mean? What is the level of learning? And did you inherit your course? And by doing that, maybe you inherited lower level learning? What is that? And does it even matter? We might say, well, who even reads the outcomes? And for a while, that seemed to be true. We thought of outcomes as something that just sat in the syllabus, that no one ever read them after the first day, and that students might not even care about them. But things have really changed since then. We have ushered in quite a strong culture of assessment and accountability and learning measurement. And so how we write our outcomes, how we communicate is a very important part of student success. Here's an example I want to share with you. I won't read all the statements about this little scenario. You can read it afterwards, but I'll just tell you that this is an anatomy and physiology course that had pre-med, nursing, and pharmacy students. And the course was organized around the major systems of the body, and students had to be able to identify and describe the location and functions of organs, bones, muscles, and tissues. And they, for the most part, were able to do that very accurately. And they came to know all these different parts very well. The instructor would find the students in the lounge practicing and memorizing these different facts that they needed to know about the body. But on the test, the instructor wanted them to explain the relationships between some of the different parts of the body and some of the principles that would cut across the different systems in the body. And while they knew very well the separate parts, they did not do well at integrating and synthesizing these parts together. And the instructor was really perplexed because she knew how much the students did know the separate parts, but they weren't able to fit them together. So we might think, well, was the course taught at the level of identifying, describing? Because if we're just giving information out, very likely by default, students will try very hard to know it, to get it right. And the instructor actually saw this. We know what the students did. They were memorizing and they were doing it successfully. But what the instructor really did want was higher level integration and tested them at the higher level. And what we can kind of see an example here is when our language isn't clear or our teaching doesn't aim for the higher levels, by default, students fall back on and often start college with thinking learning is defined as knowing about, getting it right, being able to memorize it, and show you that they recall it. And so their conception of learning that they might be bringing is a default definition that then affects their behavior, how they study, how they prepare, how they gain confidence because they're right. And so it even further could have implications on, well, why would they need to attend every class? Think about it. Why would they need to read every chapter? Why would they need to even engage in the group work or in class? Because they're thinking, if I can cram that in there, and they've been doing it well, and hold it for a day or two long enough to pass the test and get an A, that's working for them. So we have a disconnect between what we really want and often what we communicate and the levels that students understand learning is. And then that leads to students saying, I worked really hard, I studied really hard, I should get an A. So what can we do to clear up this gap and make things more transparent and move students up to the higher levels? Because when this isn't clear for them, and remember, we have 40% first generation students where there isn't likely someone there to translate what we intended versus what we actually said. So by default, they may have equated learning to being right and memorizing, or they might be feeling a confusion. They're asking me to do this, but I thought you wanted this. can lead to disengagement because the value of some of the things we ask them to do might just seem like busy work because they don't realize they have to do different things to reach the level of synthesis and solving. It can also create anxiety because they aren't sure anymore what you really do want. So you'll hear them asking, is this going to be on the test? They want to know what it is that they're supposed to learn. And that can lead to diminishing of valuing of all parts of the course in the process of learning. And so we see that by either being unclear or just aiming for lower, we aren't going to help students succeed. So when we're talking about learning, we're talking about how do we make it transparent? How do we use language that will help students understand where they should go? And when we say an outcome, I use outcome versus goals or objectives because it helps students and instructors remember the learning has to come out, of students. It can't just come out of you. So we use some tools, and taxonomies of learning are very helpful to help us break that language down to be much more clear. And I'm going to show you 3 of them very briefly. The links are provided so you can spend more time unpacking some of these tools. We'll look at Bloom's taxonomy, which is a cognitive taxonomy you may have heard of more likely. There's Fing's taxonomy, or model of significant learning, and I have a list of verbs that go with his, and Lefever's medicine wheel, and you'll see that breakdown as well. So Bloom's is cognitive staging from lower complexity to higher level complexity. So we have knowing about, the memorizing, the facts, the stating and defining, which unfortunately can be where students only aim. And sometimes courses only aim for that. And then we often want a level of summarizing or description or explaining, and even application where they then can use that knowledge to do certain things. But when we get up to the higher levels, analysis, being able to compare, to distinguish between, to separate and analyze, is much higher level complexity. And then synthesis, can they put things together based on the analysis, based on the knowledge they've acquired, so that they can hypothesize, make a recommendation, formulate a plan, invent something, design something, and then eventually being able to evaluate. Because when you know something very well and you've gone through these levels, you can step back and see the gaps, see the weaknesses, and see the faults. So the lower level isn't less important, it's just a lower level of complexity. It's very hard to sustain student engagement at the lowest level of Bloom for 15 weeks. So there's a link to the many different verbs. It's much longer than that you can, sort through and find the words that truly resonate with where you want students to go in your course. And the phrase that you would use when you write them that will help you situate it as a learning outcome is starting with the phrase by the end of the course, which situates the learning at the end. And we want the learning that's going to endure past the course. And then we put students in the phrase. Students will be able to, because we have other ways people will state an outcome. The course will, or don't even have anybody listed, right? And then it says will be able to, which helps push the person writing the outcomes to state something that is visible and measurable. Examples here: comparing artists, analyzing influences, applying principles. So you grab that verb and you put it in there, and that will help you design your assignments, your rubrics, your low stakes assessments, and your feedback. What we want to do is avoid the verbs that are very vague and used so often and are very confusing for students. When we say understand the theory of, it's very unclear. They have many courses, many instructors, and sometimes even you, when you say understand, you mean list. The next time you say it, you might want them to be able to define and compare. And the next time you say you'll be able to understand, you might want them to formulate an argument. You understand it well enough to critique. So we have to move away from these, I call them murky verbs: understand, know, be familiar with, discuss, even appreciate, because there isn't often anyone there to translate what you really intended. And it's not helpful for students to find out what they get wrong on a test that you didn't mean memorize. These higher level outcomes and expectations are one of the 8 high impact quality features that has been shown to increase student retention, graduation rates, and engagement, because this higher level gives them something to grab onto. it would be very hard to sustain their interest at these lower levels. They can do it and they can memorize it and they can often feel very confident when they get it right, but that isn't the level we're aiming for. And then Fink's taxonomy, which I have a link here for you to look at, is very different because it is affective. The right side is cognitive, very much like Bloom, but 3 types of cognitive levels. And the left side is about the more affective kinds of learning, the attitudes, the perspectives, being able to advocate or to facilitate fairly or maintain an ethical assessment. So many of our courses and our fields have some of these expectations that need to be stated in your course outcomes. You can look at the links here to the list for Fink's model as well. And finally, Lefebvre's medicine wheel, which is very different from both in that the essence of this is aiming for the relationships that goes beyond the self. So it's about the connections to the natural world, to each other, and moving past just the interest in the self. And some people have found this for their discipline or their courses to be very, very helpful. So for students, when we raise the level of transparency and the level of expectation, we remove some of the anxiety and instead give students a sense of confidence, right? It's clearer for them when they've got it and when they don't. It can be motivating when our outcomes state a little bit more than appreciate. We can help them grab onto something that makes them curious by how we state the outcomes. We can weave in real world that we are comparing and analyze Milwaukee's or urban versus rural sport challenges, right? So we can, in our outcomes, raise curiosity by how we state them when we're much more clear. We can reduce anxiety when they don't truly understand what we're after. And even our language in our outcomes can be broad enough, as well as listing or naming a variety of populations, different range of perspectives, values, and lifestyles. So we start the inclusivity language already in our course outcomes. So hopefully by this intentional stating, high as well as transparent, we can start to help students recalibrate this definition of learning that they might be carrying around by default. Now, I know people get anxious about raising the level because they'll be worried about the workload or that it will be too hard to assess, or they're going to know when their students are behind, or they're afraid they'll leave more behind, and they're afraid of overwhelming students. And I think these are good things to be concerned about. I'm glad you are. But there are tools that help offset those concerns. The pre-survey, which I never teach without it, we can help you, and I provide a link, will help you get a good gauge on where your students are starting from, so you're more realistic about where they're at versus assuming. Using the tools, the taxonomies, to be transparent, checking in with students at an anonymous mid-semester evaluation or within the first 4 weeks, just asking for a short quiz that has them answer these questions anonymously. Using rubrics, using self-assessment, peer assessment, auto-assessment frequently so that they get a sense of how they're doing. And this isn't always making you the assessor. And then using incremental learning outcomes, scaffolding along the way, redistributes the time and the early notice that you'll have if students aren't getting it. We can talk more about those, but certainly there are concerns that you might have, but there are clearly ways that you can offset those. So at this point, the point is to follow the links and look more in depth at some of these and think about how could you modify one outcome that you see that either is very vague or very low, and how could you rewrite it to become a higher level and more transparent learning outcome. And then the second question is, how can you help scale this? Maybe you have several sections teaching this course. How can you share these outcomes? Or you have a number of general education courses that you want to make more transparent and higher level. Or you have a capstone course. So, finding the things in your program, in your curriculum that need some of this work on transparency and higher level beyond just your course, as your cohorts and as your colleagues. Thank you, and contact us if you have any questions.